Today, I'd like to talk to you about some management theories and where they've started and kind of the development of those through till at least the Second World War period. Now, I'll spend some more time and detail in the live sessions on this, but just to quickly give you some context. So pre-industrial revolution, there isn't really the need to manage larger numbers of people. The only exception really is in a military context, and we'll kind of talk about that in the live sessions. Once you have industrialization starting and you start to have factories and then you start to have a fair number of people working in the same place, and there's a requirement to be able to organize and lead and manage that workforce. Frankly, a lot of the earlier industrial experience lends very heavily from concepts and practices that dated back for quite a long time in a military context. Where we're going to pick up the management theories pieces is really at the start of the turn of 1900s. So as we get from the late 1800s and into the 1900s, there's a growing movement to start to look at things differently. This manifests itself in a real rise in interest in science and in a scientific way of approaching things. This is kind of a change in the way society tends to look at things that started. You can make a good argument kind of from the 1850s on that science starts to become, or a scientific way of looking at things starts to become more and more important. In fact, a big part of the second part of the Industrial Revolution is actually a rise in chemicals and various other, science-based discoveries, different metal alloys than had been before, and this kind of fuels the whole desire to look at things from a scientific standpoint. The first individual that we'll talk about is Frederick Taylor. So Taylor, American, he is in the early 1900s is going around talking to American audiences about one of the biggest threats that they face at the moment is the inefficiency of their businesses. And that in his preaching, basically what they need to do is look at their business organizations from a scientific standpoint. And there's some key facets of this scientific management theory, right? So one of the key things that you can talk about in any of what they would call classical organizational theory, so Taylor's one, Fail is another, is that the primary function is to separate thinking tasks from doing tasks, right? So what's the role of management versus what's the role of the workers? Because honestly, for concepts that we're fairly familiar with today, we're not all that familiar or in that much practice back then. You had workers, you had management. Management usually was a product of societal class structure versus skill sets. And the two groups there was some degree of animosity between the two. And management abdicated some roles to workers that, frankly, according to Taylor, they shouldn't have. One of the big ways is basically how to do something. So in early industrial experience, you would have multiple people doing the exact same thing. And it was common that they would basically let the workers kind of figure out how to do it. The challenge was that you then had potentially 20 or 30 different ways of doing the exact same thing, and tremendous inconsistencies that took place. Whereas according to Taylor, it was management's responsibility to figure out what was the best way to do something and to basically kind of enforce that consistency on the workforce so that you would have a consistent experience. One of the other things that was pretty common at the time is there really was no encouragement for workers to work hard. And in fact, there was a pretty common term that was referred to at the time as soldiering, which is basically kind of just going along at a fairly easy or relaxed pace. And if you kind of worked harder or tried to do more stuff, you would often, suffer the wrath of other workers that didn't want management to know that they were capable of doing more. because frankly, they for the most part didn't get paid any differently, regardless of what they did. Um, the roles that they filled were ones that tended to be very mechanistic. I mean, think of them as a machine as opposed to as a person. So, very strong emphasis, just kind of go through the motions, right? Overall, the aspects of scientific management, and you'll read more about it in the textbook, it emphasizes efficiency. That's kind of the hallmark of scientific management. It's about efficiency. There's nothing about satisfaction of workers. And in fact, at this stage of the game, workers are more things than they are people, and they're in fact treated more like things than they are people. Certainly from today's eyes, that's one of the stark revelations that we would have. Big focus on breaking down tasks into smaller components that you would study for optimization. Some of this thinking, by the way, starts to manifest itself in things like assembly lines, right? So Henry Ford's assembly line really pulls out of a lot of these, a lot of the basis of this kind of way of thinking at things. You want to separate out thinking tasks from physical tasks. And the net effect of what happened was it actually significantly increased production in a time of poorly educated workforce. So most of the workforce at this point is not very well educated. They may be literate, lots of them are not literate. As I said, so some of the capacities of these individuals are kind of limited, certainly from today's standpoint, limited. And so this way of reorganizing or rethinking of the way that you approach stuff had some very, very significant productivity outcomes. Now, you'll read in the textbook about Fayol, who's a Frenchman. Fayol developed a very similar theory around a similar time frame as Taylor. There's no reason to believe that the two knew each other, because certainly back then, sharing information across the ocean wasn't as widespread as it certainly would be today. I mean, you could write things that could physically move from one place to another, right? But you don't really have telephones, you don't have internet, you don't have any of that other stuff. You have the beginnings of telegraph stuff starting to happen, but really there's very limited abilities for them to share. And in fact, Fayol's work wasn't fairly well known in North America until after the Second World War. Short story, he got brought into a steel concern in France. And certainly at this stage of the game in Western economies, steel was the big economic driver. It was, whoever controlled the steel production kind of controlled the industry in a lot of ways. So it was a very big deal. He actually got brought in to wrap that business up because it had not been very successful. And in a period of, I think it was something like 10 years, instead of wrapping it up, he actually turned it around and made it one of the most successful organizations in France. And then his teachings and the things that he wrote were based on his experience with that transformation. And you see a lot of similarities between Taylor's scientific management and Fayol's work as well. I think Fayol captures some of the value of people as people and workers, certainly much better than scientific management does. And there's elements of that that's, I think, better represented. Both of those would be considered classical organizational theory. So really the broad strokes of classical organization theory is it's about efficiency, it's about separation of powers between thinking tasks and work tasks. What's management supposed to do? What are workers supposed to do? And the focus is efficiency, is productivity. It's not satisfaction. It's not any of those other pieces. Excuse me. Around the late 1920s, right? There's a fairly, the end of the 20s is a fairly booming economic time, and particularly in the US. And in the US, there's an experiment that takes place between the National Institutes of Science in Washington, DC, and the Western Electric facility at Hawthorne. So this is Hawthorne, it's now in Chicago. At the time, it was just outside of the city of Chicago. And Western Electric is like your high tech of the day, right? So they made telegraph equipment, vacuum tubes, things like that. And they were a very progressive employer for the time. They'd had a company pension plan, I think, since the early 1900s. They were certainly out ahead in a lot of these ways from most of the other organizations, right? It's not unlike what we see today in high tech, right? So there's all kinds of things about how tech operates and things they do for compensation for their employees and the workplace and so on and so forth that reflects kind of cutting edge theories and ideas in practice. So they're the same kind of deal. So what they're trying to do is understand what's the effect of the people on the productivity. So they decide to start something where they're going to kind of mess around with some of the environmental aspects of the workplace to see what effect that has on the productivity of the people. So one of the first things they start doing is they experiment with the illumination. So they put in lights. Now, at this point in time, you have electrical light, but generally speaking, workplaces are not overly well lit, certainly industrial ones. If you see any old industrial buildings, they're characteristic of very large windows because you used a lot of natural light. You didn't use an awful lot of artificial light supplementation. You did have light bulbs. The incandescent bulbs are not overly efficient or effective. So again, net result is it's not usually all that bright. So what they do is in a certain area within the facility, they install these new lights and they increase the illumination. Well, the productivity goes up. But the weird thing is the productivity goes up in areas that they didn't change the lighting in. And then when they turn the lights off, the productivity is still up. So they're not really sure what's going on. And crucially, late 1929, you have the stock market crash, which basically eliminates a tremendous amount of wealth from the world's economy, starting with the US, but it creates a ripple effect throughout the entire world and plunges into the Great Depression. So National Institutes of Science don't really have money to spend on things like this, so they discontinue. And it's basically inconclusive. Western Electric actually picks the mantle up on their own in the early 1930s. And they decide to start looking at some of those behaviors, but in a different way. And specifically, they pick a part of their organization called the relay room. So relays are essentially complicated switches that are used for telecommunications equipment in this case. And in this room, I think there's 8 women that hand assembled these particular relays. And so they work with these women on making up all kinds of different changes to how they do things and how things are laid out and of all kinds of other things. And they kind of discuss these changes pretty freely with them. And they're quite integrated what's going on to kind of understand what's going on. And the productivity just goes through the roof. All of a sudden, these women are creating so many more relays than they did before. And as they started to peel back the layers, they started to understand that the difference was the women were much more engaged in the work they were doing. And as a result, they were far more productive than when you're just kind of soldiering along in a very mechanistic kind of way. And this change in behavior, and this is the beginnings of understanding what they call human relations theory, which is basically about how you approach and respond to people as people in the workplace and the effect that has on productivity. That really brings up the topic of motivation, because ultimately what happens in the workplace is how much you do and how hard you work ultimately is a product of your choice. You'll be asked to do certain things. There may be quotas, there may be, metrics they have in place. At the end of the day, how much you or anybody else does is going to be a choice that you make. There are circumstances that make it easier to make that choice. There are circumstances that make it harder to make that choice. But at the end of the day, it's a choice you make. And ultimately, the choice comes down to how motivated you feel to do that. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to look at motivation, and we'll kind of quickly look at a few different angles of them. One of the big ones is extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, right? So intrinsic motivation, one way to think about it is it's motivation that emanates from outside of you, right? So material satisfaction, psychological, physiological needs, things like that are extrinsic motivators. Intrinsic, if another way, is kind of like from within you, right? So how do I feel about the work that I do? Do I think it's important? Does it fulfill aspects of, meaning in my life? Okay. And they're not one or the other, right? We respond to both. How we respond to them is a little different from each other. So I'm not sure if you've heard of a gentleman whose name is Abraham Maslow. This is actually a diagram of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Essentially, what the theory talks about is that there are these distinct different levels, and whatever level you self-identify on is the only level where those things motivate you, right? So starting at the bottom one, you see the physiological. if you're motivated at this level, you're just interested in sleep, eat, shelter. Like this is a pretty basic, live kind of function. And in fact, if you got lost in the wilderness and you were all on your own and, you were disconnected from everyone or everything else, pretty much everything that's going to motivate you and drive your behavior and activities is going to be about protect myself, rest, eat, things like that. Now, once you have those things, they don't motivate you anymore. So once you hopefully don't have to worry about these particular things, it's not a big motivator, right? And in fact, what happens to people is we come into our lives when we're first born, and the physiological is kind of the entire space that we're in. And all of our actions and reactions are kind of motivated in that area. As we grow, we actually move up the pyramid, right? So, younger children, once we get out of the baby stage, safety is a really big thing, right? Both economic and physical security, being with mom and dad, and feeling protected and safe and things like that. You get into school, belonging, right? Acceptance, family and friends, particularly friends. Think back to particularly high school, right? The level of connectivity and how you feel about friends and other groups and stuff like that is such a tremendous motivator for behavior. In the workplace, for the most part, you'll find workers are motivated by either self-actualization or esteem. I think certainly my experience has been far more esteem than self-actualization. Sometimes you find self-actualization. I find it more common when you find people who are older. And I think it's because they've kind of matured in the space and now they start to do things more for the purposes of the things that they're doing, kind of for fulfillment and legacy and things like that. Although you certainly can have young people that are self-actualization motivated as well. And it could be in one place I'm more esteem and another place I'm more self-actualization. It is a circumstantial sort of thing. And there's a variety of variations of that particular theory, right? So one of them is Herzberg's two-factor, which basically looks at you cut the pyramid, right, along esteem and belonging, and below are considered dissatisfiers and above are satisfiers. And essentially what the theory says is basically in the workplace, you can't motivate someone by belonging, safety, or physiologically, because they're already things that they will have for the most part. You can dissatisfy them by not meeting the expectations, right? So if you go to show up at the workplace and there's no shelter, they expect you to be working outside and that wasn't what you expected, right? And it's not a safe environment and you don't like the people that you work with, you're going to be dissatisfied. But because it's a nice building and because it seems to be safe and because of the people that you like to work with, won't motivate you to do a better job longer term. It's basically the foundation. So what organizations need to do is they need to build a foundation on these levels that does not dissatisfy, right? And if anything, what you ideally want to do is you want to slightly overachieve expectations in these areas. Not a whole bunch, because you don't get an awful lot longer term out of employees from doing that, but you want to slightly overachieve. And I mentioned before in expectations, once you deliver something, that sets an expectation then. So then the next time it has to be at least that or more, or at least that or more, right? So one of the things that's important is to manage the expectations in that area, but in such a way that you don't dissatisfy employees. And then what you do from a motivational standpoint is that you focus on the satisfiers. So things that will positively affect esteem potentially, or things that will affect self-actualization, okay? There's another theory that we'll talk about, which is the X or Y. So this is Douglas McGregor. It's a little bit of the kind of the approach that you take sets the conditions of the results that you see, right? So basically, theory X is negative view of human nature, right? People don't want to work, they're going to steal from me, I got to, watch them like a hawk and have cameras all the time and continually prod them and so on and so forth. And the truth is, if you treat people like that over the intermediate and long term, that's exactly the kind of behavior that you will get. This is and the reason why this is postulated is because it goes to the culture, right? So if you create a culture in your organization that reinforces this negative view, you will tend to create behaviors that support that. Theory Y is the opposite. It's a positive view, right? Believing people want to do a good job, right? They want to be successful. They want to solve their own things. They want some autonomy and some authority in things that they do. And again, treat people that way in the intermediate and long term. For the most part, that's the behavior that you will see. Theory Z, we'll just quickly touch on, is essentially another way of talking about the Japanese style of management that kind of is post World War II, and certainly throughout all of the quality, Duran and Deming and Ishikawa and so on and so forth space. And it's characterized by long-term employment. I mentioned before, usually it's lifetime unless you choose to do something else or go somewhere else. You get a job at Nissan or Mitsubishi or whoever, and there's a place for you for as long as you are willing to work. Promotions are slow for reasons that we've talked about before. There's a fair bit of job rotation, partly to enhance the employees and make it a better experience for them. It also tends to make those employees even more valuable because they have more wide-ranging and relevant experiences. Consensus style decision making, and there really is a genuine concern for the employee as a whole. And some of this mirrors some of the traditional Japanese cultural ways of looking at life and people, and kind of what's the right way to approach things, because their culture is distinctly different than many Western ones. It's a far more collective kind of approach versus the kind of the heavily individualistic you see in the West, particularly in the US. That's your theory Z stuff. Situational leadership, just quickly. So Hersey and Blanchard basically looked at, I've mentioned before, the leadership style that you have is not so much about what you as the leader want to do, it's more about what's appropriate for your employees. And it will in fact be different for each employee. And that's one of the things as a decent leader or manager that you'll ultimately learn, is that you need to know your people, because you need to know what it is they need from you in order for them to be successful. And that will change over time and over circumstance. The two big dimensions they looked at had to do with the complexity of the task and the relationship that you had between the leadership and the employee, right? So, and it required a different mode. So if the task is relatively high for you. So if you're starting, for example, in a new job, and you don't really know how to do the job yet because you need to be trained and you don't really know anybody, that's kind of the telling mode. What you need from me as the leader is specific instruction, close supervision, and support. As you start to develop along, the relationship will go up, and the complexity of the task in that particular case will start to go down. So you'll end up moving probably towards number 3, right? Which was higher relationship, lower task. And then what's appropriate is, we're sharing ideas, there's encouragement, there's more coaching, it's more of that kind of stuff, right? And this is the essence of situational leadership, is that it's very based on the situation, right? And it does change over time. Then the last piece we have on here to talk about today is Covey's 7 Habits. This material is certainly been around for a long time. I think it's 50 years plus now. It continues to sell well in book and audio formats. And the reason it does is because it's a very effective way of looking at life. It isn't strictly a business way of looking at things, although that it certainly is applicable in that space. It's much more about you, because one of the things that you'll find is what you do and how the decisions you make and how you choose to respond to things will very much flavor the kind of success over the intermediate and longer term that you'll see in life. So the steps that you take and the way that you approach things will shape those experiences, right? So you do want to be familiar with the 7 habits, certainly from a recognition standpoint. There are some questions in the question bank that won't necessarily ask you to list all of them, but will give you a question where you have to be able to recognize things that are part of the 7 habits and things that are not. I'll spend a little more detail on this because frankly, I think it's very important stuff when we do the live sessions.